My name is Limor, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. On February 5th, 2022, Rob and I did a podcast with Professor Brian Van Norden, the James Monroe Taylor Chair of Philosophy at Vassar College in New York, and a friend of the podcast. On that podcast, you can take a look at it. We talked about Kong Yi Ji. This is one of Lu Xun's most popular stories. It's about a century old, and this year, the story started blowing up on the Chinese internet. We are, of course, talking about Kong Yi Ji Wenshui, that is Kong Yi Ji literature. Why is a 100-year-old story becoming popular on the Chinese internet? At first, I assumed it was because Professor Van Norden is just that interesting, and his chat with us had convinced China's young people to start thinking about it again. But it turns out that's not the only reason, though I assume it is part of it. The main reason the story has become so popular on the Chinese internet, and it really is very popular, the story has become a metaphor about the dark prospects for youth employment, or really youth unemployment, in today's China. In June, CNN reported that the Chinese government has grown so concerned that they have cut interest rates to try and goose the economy. The joblessness rate for those between 16 and 24 years old is 20.8%. Geez, that's close to Brazil's 2022 unemployment level. Kong Yi Ji has become sort of a metaphor for youth unemployment and youths who feel like their education has not prepared them for the right jobs, or people who thought they would be guaranteed a job because they had a good college education, and then suddenly they're out delivering food on scooters. Today I'm just going to give a brief introduction to the story, and then we're going to jump to the main text of this episode. That is a rap that has made its way around Bilibili, a Chinese video social media like TikTok, but not TikTok. Just briefly, the Lu Xun story is about a guy who is left behind by the times. He was trying to be a scholar out of the mold of traditional China. These guys that 200 years ago, everybody wanted to be. People who studied the Confucian classics, read all the right books, passed the imperial exam. They were wealthy, they had social prestige, they had jobs. It meant that you were made. But then in 1905, the government decided to completely change how it selected officials. It abandoned the Keju testing system. That's the imperial exam system. A few years later, in 1911, the imperial government collapsed completely, and those exams and that whole system of education became even less relevant. Kong Yi Ji is a guy who's pitiful. He's apparently a very smart guy. He's educated, but because of changes in the times, his education doesn't matter. When we meet him in the story, he is this really poor guy. He still wears the long suit that people who pass the Keju test could wear. This is a mark of kind of prestige. But when you look at his long suit, and sometimes this is translated as long gown, but when you look at his long suit, his clothes are dirty and he's asking for booze at the bar. In the cheap part of the bar, he's standing in the bar. He's not sitting down. He doesn't actually have enough money to sit down. People at the bar are there making fun of him. He goes through several scenes. We see him getting beaten up because he's trying to steal books. He's trying to make a living selling his education credentials to families to be a tutor. Never really makes that much money. We don't really know what happens to him, but in the end, we're just left with this image of this very pitiful guy who time left behind. This guy has hit rock bottom, even though, according to the old rules of society, he did everything he was supposed to do to get social prestige. He passed the test. He should have been at the height of his power, but the era, it passed him by. That is really the message that resonates with kids in China today. China has done a great job of getting kids into college. They have brought about this massive expansion of college education over the last 40 years. But now today, many of the recent graduates are saying there are not enough jobs, particularly not enough jobs to fit their skill set. That is the skill set of an educated urban elite. A lot of them are having to turn to becoming delivery drivers for the equivalent of Uber Eats. You have the emergence this last year of what's called Kong Yi Ji literature, Kong Yi Ji Wenshui. People are talking about how they feel just like Kong Yi Ji. They feel like they're overeducated and poor and ridiculed by society. This became a really big deal. It was such a trend in social media that back March 17th of 2023, CCTV, the main TV station in China, aired a segment on how Kongiji literature was nonsense. CCTV said that the blame actually fell on kids not working hard enough. They said all you needed to do was struggle and things would be A-OK. It was the Chinese propaganda equivalent to arguing that back in my day, we had to walk to school through snow, uphill, both ways. As y'all can imagine, telling teenagers and college students that they weren't working hard enough was not very effective at anything other than making them matter. And that gets us to today's text. That is a rap song called Sunny Optimistic Kongiji. So this song was uploaded onto Bilibili, which, as I said before, is a Chinese social media akin to TikTok. It was uploaded by an anonymous person whose name is Gui Shangge, or Ghost Mountain Brother. He took a song called Optimistic Boy, Yangguang Kailang Da Nanhai, and he rewrote the lyrics. Now, just to give y'all a flavor of the song, I'm going to play a bit of it here for y'all. It's my understanding that because I am essentially an independent journalist reporting on literature, that my playing of the song does not violate copyright law, although it's not actually clear that this song is even copywritten. Here we go. I'm just going to play a short bit just to make sure that I steer clear of any copyright issues. Okay, that was only a short bit, but it kind of gives you an idea of the song. I'm going to translate a section that includes the part that I just played for you. A quick warning here, this is a rap song. There's a bit of foul language in it. I'm going to bleep it, but I just wanted to give you a heads up. Okay, here is the song. So the title of the song is Optimistic Kongiji, Yangguang Kailang Kongiji. I put on an old busted long suit. I go straight to Lu Xun Inn. I call up the waiter, bring 2 warm cups of booze, and a plate of fennel beans for 9 strings cash. I spout some highfalutin literary nonsense and make everybody laugh. Without realizing it, my face turns red. How you going to pollute my purity like this? I drink a mouthful of booze and continue arguing with them. This is the reason that Rickshaw Boy died. It is because he did not work hard enough pulling that rickshaw. Every story Lu Xun wrote, he broached topics that weren't supposed to be broached. When Chen Sheng led the rebellion, overthrowing the Qin dynasty, his life wasn't sweet. Why? It was because he could not act all earnest and down to earth. In the end, the customers' eyes all moved towards me. They ask me, "What kind of thing are you?" I look at my long suit and say, I am, and here's the chorus. Sunny optimistic Kongiji, sunny optimistic Kongiji. He wrote about things that went beyond propriety. Now you ask me if I'm convinced. Sunny optimistic Kongiji, sunny optimistic Kongiji. My labor power has fallen underwater. I am not selling it cheap to you. Sunny optimistic Kongiji, sunny optimistic Kongiji. You drive a Lamborghini and laugh at me for not working hard enough. Sunny optimistic Kongiji, sunny optimistic Kongiji. The corrupt society of old, what the f*** does it have to do with me? So that's one verse plus the chorus. Here's another verse. After they have heard everything I said, everyone in the inn is filled with a happy air. They yell at me, challenging, arguing, ridiculing me. What do you have to do with me? Going to college, that is to help China rise. And it is not so that I can be a delivery boy. Everybody reveals their impudent smile when they are done listening to me, all except the stupid c***. Okay, let me just unpack this last verse. Everybody at the bar is listening to him. Then they start laughing at him, yelling at him, arguing with him. They ask, what does Kongiji's situation have to do with us? How are his struggles, how are Kongiji's struggles to get a job commensurate with his education related to anything that has to do with these other people at the bars? The singer poet says, I went to college. The reason was supposed to be so that I could help contribute to China's rise, not so that I could be a delivery boy on China's streets. Everybody laughs at what I'm saying, except for the stupid, and I'm not going to use that word. So that is that verse kind of explicated line by line. One thing I find interesting about this song is that you have a mix of so many different registers. At times, the song is actually kind of in the Lu Xun story. You have this guy who's taking on the persona of Kong Yichi. People are arguing with him. People are yelling at him, just like Lu Xun's story. But then you have these passages where there are clear references to other stuff that happened in our contemporary era. So there is that line, going to college, that's to help China's rise. And it is not so that I can be a delivery boy. In China, as Lu Xun is writing, there are a few Western-style universities. Most people at the time didn't go to universities. It was the Keju exam that was the big deal. So it's clear we're not in the temporal space of Lu Xun's story. What we are is we are in modern China. The term he uses after that, China's rise and delivery boys, those both make it pretty clear that we're talking about modern day China. But then he goes kind of back and forth between these different temporal spaces. It's kind of jarring, and it was hard when I was trying to translate the poem to actually work through this, especially at the beginning. You feel like you are in Lu Xun's story, or you feel like he's pretending to be in Lu Xun's story. Just to go back to that very beginning, I put on an old busted long suit. I go straight to Lu Xun Inn. I call up the waiter, bring 2 warm cups of booze, a plate of fennel beans for 9 strings cash. So, the reference to 9 strings of cash, that's an old form of currency that's no longer used. Lu Xun Inn is the name of the inn in Lu Xun's story. You have him wearing this long suit, which was associated with the educated upper classes in imperial China, something that people don't really wear today. So it's jarring to have things go back and forth like this. Another thing I wanted to point out, in the passage that I read, there are the lines, "This is the reason that rickshaw boy died. It is because he did not work hard enough pulling that rickshaw." Every story Lu Xun wrote, he broached topics that you weren't supposed to broach. When Chen Sheng led the rebellion, overthrowing the Qin dynasty, his life then wasn't sweet. Why? It's because he could not act all earnest and down to earth. So again, this kind of allusion to things that happened way in the deep past. Rickshaw Boy is a story by Lao Shi, writing roughly around the same time that Lu Xun is writing. It's a social tragedy. This character gets caught in societal forces that are beyond his control. He falls into poverty, and it's a very sad story. The reference to Chen Sheng is actually even more interesting. This is the rebel who overthrew the Qin dynasty. In evoking Chen Sheng, I thought it was fascinating because they're hinting that conditions have gotten so bad that the people who are educated and are having to do this menial manual labor have gotten to the point that they're so angry that maybe they're going to overthrow the dynasty. Of course, the dynasty today is not the Qin dynasty, it's the CCP. There's just so much to unpack in this song. I find it fascinating. I'm going to read another short part of my translation from the song. Here it goes. Originally, I thought work would be laid back. I never wanted to work the 996 kind of job. Once I'm done working, because I'm evil, I ask for my salary. Here I am starving, and I get thrown into jail by officials. This evil old society, why don't they have labor laws? This passage is clearly ironic. You have this guy, the singer, this poet. He got to a very high skill level in college. He expects work to be laid back. 996, of course, is a reference to the work culture that's common, that's expected at Chinese internet companies. You work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. That's 72 hours a week. China, of course, has strict labor laws on paper, but everybody ignores them. They're not strictly enforced, particularly at internet companies. this song is all about how young folks today are China's most educated generation, but they are finding that the economy does not have jobs that match their education or match their expectations. So in the song, when he says, this evil old society, why don't they have labor laws? It's a good example of this kind of jarring effect of mixing these two different time spaces. You have this question, is he talking about the time of Kong Yiji 100 years ago? Is he talking about today? I mean, it's pretty clear from the lines before it that he's talking about today. There's a level of irony. He's speaking on two different levels, and there is a kind of deniability. It made this song, poem, whatever you want to call it, both difficult to translate, but also a really engaging song. You can't quite pin it down. It's not clear sometimes what it's actually referring to, or it's a phrase like this evil old society. In China today, clearly that would refer to the time before 1949, before the CCP took over. But based just on the context of the poem, the song, it's very evident that it's referring to today, and it's making this comparison between way back before the CCP took over and today, and saying, actually, not that much has changed. Sorry, I keep saying song and poem sometimes. I don't really consider songs and poems different kinds of text. For me, when I think about them, they're essentially the same thing. A rap is just a poem. And if you think about this, this makes sense. In old and medieval English, and I think a lot of different European languages, poems were meant to be sung. We just don't have a record of the music because they didn't have a means of recording music. If you think about it in Chinese, the word for poetry is 诗歌. Literally, that just means poem song, poetry song, something like that. In Chinese, you have this real blending of the idea of song and poetry. I think for most languages, the distinction between song and poetry is really an artificial distinction. So they're just kind of the same thing. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox. What I find most interesting about this poem is the way it reinterprets the story from a century ago, and it shows us that Lu Xun is still relevant. Lu Xun still speaks to people. When I have taught Lu Xun to Chinese students, a lot of times they say, he's really hard to understand. But it seems like, at the very least, a lot of kids in China are still reading Lu Xun, and they are still finding him very relevant. Okay, I'm going to end this episode with a word rather than doing a chengyu. This is a word that I encountered in the poem that we looked at today on sunny, optimistic Kong Yiji. 这腐朽的旧社会和我有几把关系. I translated that line as, this old corrupt society, what the f*** does it have to do with me? Now, let's talk about this word, 鸡巴. So, first off, 鸡巴 literally means something like chicken's butt, but it's not written that way because it's profanity. In Chinese, they actually use different Hanzi, different Chinese characters to write it. So when the lyrics appear in the music video on the song, when it's on Bilibili, it actually says something slightly different, but that's just euphemism for 鸡巴. The word that I used in English is f***. That's because it's used in a way that is very similar to that English word. The word 鸡巴 can only be used as an adverb that makes your language stronger. So unlike the English word, you can't use this word 鸡巴 as a verb. It can only be used as an adverb. It's kind of like if y'all have ever encountered Irish English, the word fickin, F-E-C-K-I-N. It's less profane, and it also can only be used as an adverb. Okay, that was a longish linguistic digression. We moved from China to Ireland. That's kind of out of the way, but I really love the language part of the podcast since I started doing the podcast on my own, since Rob left the podcast. I like this, and I enjoy going off on digressions like that. Do you like my linguistic digressions? Is that okay if I'm doing that? Do you like or not like other parts of the podcast? Send me an email. Let me know how I'm doing. I love connecting with fans. My email is ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. Also, if you do like the podcast, consider showing your support through Patreon, Chinese Literature Podcast on Patreon. I love hearing that people like what I'm doing. The thing that I like about Patreon is not the money so much, it's the clear evidence that people like and support what I'm doing. Okay, before we go, just a reminder, I am going to put this translation along with a link to the YouTube video of the song onto the website, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. Check it out. That's it. I'm Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.